Now that the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Bill is said to be passed as an act, government officials are hopeful that in some ways this will be able to deal with the scourge. Activists, academics and ordinary citizens have called for harsher sentences for perpetrators. There are also concerns about how law enforcement officials are handling cases. For more on this, let's bring in Germanos, who's the founder of the Embrace Project. Leanne, thanks very much indeed for your time. It's great to have you on the program. This council, at least to my understanding, is meant to be some kind of statutory response to the scourge of gender-based violence. But there have been other interventions in the past, including the National Strategic Plan. Help us connect the dots about how the council fits into those responses and other interventions.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for having me on. I think just to explain the role of the council and the National Strategic Plan, as you mentioned earlier. So the council is supposed to be now this, I guess, the government's response to fighting the scourge of gender-based violence and femicide. We don't as yet have that is dedicated to that, to driving the response, to overseeing the response. And this bill is meant to sort of create the statutory body that does exactly that. So the National Council is actually supposed to be made up of government as well as civil society. So I think there's about six government departments that will form part of a 13-member National Council, and then the rest of the 7 will come from civil society. The idea is to have this National Council actually drive the National Strategic Plan. It's supposed to be implementing the plan, which has already been drafted, already been finalized, and was actually set out for public comment at the same time as the National Council on GBVF bill. So, in effect, this council is now supposed to almost replace what has previously been like the steering committee on gender-based violence, the interim steering committee, and now we currently sit with an interministerial committee, right, which consists of these government departments that the National Council is supposed to consist of when the Act becomes promulgated, and then when the council is finally formulated.
Yeah, and I know you formed an integral part in the process leading us up to this point. For instance, public comments were open, I think, in October last year, and you made several recommendations, including, by the way, to amendments to how we define gender-based violence, what's included and not included in that definition. Are you satisfied with how things have fared insofar as that process is concerned?
To be honest, I think we're fairly satisfied in the fact that we made about, I think, 11 pertinent recommendations when it came to the bill. We submitted our recommendations in December. Out of those 11, I think 6 of them were properly taken on and actually resulted in amendments to the finalized version of the bill, which was gazetted on Friday, the 30th. And then some of them obviously weren't accepted, but just to run through some of the pertinent recommendations that we made, which were actually, which then did result in amendments. We, for example, noticed that the National Council, or at least the bill, didn't actually require that the council be made up of, for example, a specific number of women, which we thought would not be very representative of an issue which predominantly impacts women. So we recommended that at least 51% of the board of the council be made up of women. And that was taken up by the department, because in the finalized version of the bill, we now see that there is an express provision which requires that 80% of the board be made up of women. Another issue that we raised was the fact that there were disqualifications to becoming a member of the board, or at least a member of a subcommittee of the board. Right. The disqualifications included being convicted for gender-based violence and femicide-related crimes, as well as having then to be sentenced for it. Our recommendation was that the additional sentencing requirement should be removed. It should be sufficient to be convicted of any GBVF-related crime, and be automatically disqualified from sitting on the board as a result thereof. And the department once again actually took on that recommendation, and they removed sentencing, for example, as an additional requirement for disqualification. They also took on a recommendation from us that, they must be very mindful of the fact that public perception on the council is paramount. The public has to have confidence and trust in the council in order for it to be effective. So what the department then did is that it added that any board member or nominee who has been convicted of any crime actually becomes then ineligible to sit on the board. And those were some of the, for us, some of the pertinent recommendations that we made that were then followed through. We also requested that ministerial condonation, which would allow the minister to actually appoint a board member who would have, for example, been convicted of a GBVF-related crime. We asked for the removal of that provision, and it was taken out.
Sure. Yeah, there's obviously quite a few of those recommendations, and it's great to see that there's a lot of thought that's gone into what this council ought to look like if it's going to make some kind of impact. In the past, many activists have really pushed for some kind of intersectional response to gender-based violence. In other words, the way, for instance, black poor women might experience the scourge may not necessarily translate to any other demographic. Do you reckon that there are enough of those kind of sensitivities considered in the establishment of this council so that we are able to respond appropriately to those nuances?
So I think the intersectional or addressing the intersectionality of the discrimination that comes into play when it comes to gender-based violence or even like just discrimination in general, I think that is reflective in the council in the sense that the government departments that are required to be members of the council, one of the or 6 of the 13, are departments that are sort of across the board. It includes, for example, the Department of Social Development, the Ministry of Police, the Department of Women, I think Health as well, and there are 2 others that don't come to mind immediately. But those different departments are meant to actually be addressing those different elements of the intersectional discrimination that comes into GBVF. Now, of course, recognizing the intersectionalities and taking them on, that is more outlined in the National Strategic Plan, which has been developed obviously to prevent and combat gender-based violence and femicide, and that plan is exactly what the National Council is then supposed to be implementing. So that is taken into account, but just not necessarily in this particular bill, but rather in the plan and how the council is supposed to implement the plan thereafter.
Yeah, well, I think it goes without saying that the council itself has a great task ahead. Many will say every intervention thus far simply hasn't worked. It raises questions around where the council is going to be getting its money and how they can be held accountable for how they spend that money.
So all of those provisions and at least around like the finances and financial management, those have been actually detailed and outlined in the bill itself.
Right.
So, you know, as with everything in our country at the moment, we have great legislation. It's just been the implementation that has been lacking on our part. So the hope is that there will be proper oversight, proper implementation of the provisions which require very strict monitoring of the funding, where it goes. For example, the council is not just going to be made up of a board. It's going to have a secretariat. It's going to have a CEO. And, you know, obviously the funding in that way is then also regulated and funneled by professionals who are experienced in distribution of funding of this kind, with a board obviously being, you know, the oversight mechanism within the council. You know, the CEO and the secretary, I think, being more the executives of the council. The hope is, that the funding is properly used for what it's meant to go towards. But, you know, that aside, as you said, it's quite a mammoth task regardless. I mean, gender-based violence and femicide is a scourge.
Right.
And it's not just about, you know, being able to eradicate it. It's about being able to prevent it. So it's really, you know, getting down to the root causes of why South Africans, and in particular South African men, are so violent towards women. You know, that I think is going to be the biggest challenge.
Yeah, precisely. The president calling it a second pandemic. Some people now pushing back and saying perhaps it's actually the first. Leanne, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Really do appreciate your time and insights today. Leanne Germanos is the founder of an organization looking to combat gender-based violence called Embrace Project. Once again, thanks very much indeed.